Amazon, Chronicles from the Afterlands. SlushFund.
A bloody mess. That's how Lieutenant Alfonso Tavares assessed the situation as he dragged out of breath yet another body towards the muddy bank of the Amazon River. The body of Corporal Correa. The friction against the dirt had almost completely covered the dead man's uniform patch of the 34th Section of the Amazon Republican Army's Riverine Brigade. The same patch that Lieutenant Tavares wore on his own uniform. The emblem of fraternity he shared with his 6 men. The very ones he was now tossing into the river. Lieutenant Tavares suppressed the surge of guilt, twisting his guts. He hadn't killed them, God no. He had just given them the order to collect honey from the beehives they had spotted at the top of a promontory. The lieutenant's men had obeyed with an unusual but understandable enthusiasm. They had been starving for days aboard their patrol boat. Once again, rations were delivered weeks late by Alvarezopoulos' procurement center. Only for the lieutenant and his men to discover that most of the stock was rotten. Even the local petrosaurs, despite their widespread reputation as walking garbage disposal, refused to eat them. So did Luis Angel, the old crook who lived nearby and with whom the lieutenant and his men occasionally bartered rations for bootleg moonshine. Still, the soldiers considered themselves lucky. Rumors were circulating about cases of lead poisoning in the nearby garrison of Progreso. Somewhere along the endless chain linking the production of rations to their final delivery, someone had decided to cut corners on packaging quality. Greed or plain corruption? No one would ever know. And in any case, the culprit was surely close enough to the regime to remain untouchable. Such was life in Amazon. Corporal Correa's body vanished into the muddy waters of the river. Only one remained. And then it would all be over. Sergeant Viana. He was the one Lieutenant Tavares had been calling for when he realized that none of his men were returning with the coveted honey. Convinced they were feasting without him, the officer decided to leave the boat and find them himself. Under the watchful gaze of the petrosaurs swimming nearby, the lieutenant had laboriously climbed the rocky promontory where the beehives stood. And that's when he found them. Sergeant Viana, Corporal Correa, Private Silvera, Private Lins, Private Pexoto, Private Das. Each of them had a small wooden splinter lodged in their throat. A dart soaked in Amazon viper venom, judging by their purple tongues and swollen faces. It was designed to be fired from a traditional blowpipe, like those once used by the now extinct Ovavolajos native tribe, as if to leave its signature on the crime. Lieutenant Tavares froze. Officially, the Ovavolajos resistance had been crushed, and yet, for some time now, the soldiers had been whispering stories to each other. The kind of rumors one spreads to scare oneself, without really believing them. A soldier who knew another soldier, who swore that a third had seen yet another get killed by a strange woman with black hair. A woman whose eerie silhouette had been spotted throwing snakes into soldiers' hammocks at night. And who was also said to be responsible for the disappearance of entire sections of troops sent on patrol, just like Lieutenant Tavares' own men. The lieutenant, who was now far more inclined to believe these rumors. He had drawn his gun, then scanned the nearby bushes and canopy. No one. He allowed himself to take a breath, almost surprised by his own composure. If the killer was still nearby, they would have probably attacked by now. Common sense dictated that the lieutenant should not linger in the area, though, and should instead leave immediately aboard the boat, setting course for the Puebla garrison. But his composure had already hardened into steely cynicism. For some time now, an unofficial order had been making its way through the ranks of command and the officers. Cut costs at any price. Now, 6 soldiers killed in action meant a hefty sum to be paid to their families, especially since full pensions were at stake. And not to mention that the cause of their death seemed to directly contradict the official truth dictated by President Alvarez's regime, namely that there was no longer any Vovolahos resistance, and in Antonio Alvarez's Amazon, reality was expected to conform to the regime's version, not the other way round. Most of all, Lieutenant Tavares had recently been informed of the establishment of a slush fund, or rather, to use its official designation, an anti-desertion bonus. Its mechanism was really simple. Officers who reported cases of desertion within their ranks received a bonus, a sum that, purely by coincidence of course, amounted to exactly 1/4 of the total pension the regime paid to the families of soldiers who had fallen in the line of duty. A bonus paid immediately, in cash. The calculation was then plain simple for Lieutenant Tavares. 6 reported deaths, 6 full pensions to be paid by the regime, and nothing but scraps for the officer in charge of the fallen, namely himself. 6 reported deserters, a fraction of that sum paid directly to the lieutenant as a tax-free bonus. A trivial amount for the administration, but a substantial one for the officer. And the truth was, Lieutenant Tavares needed money. Everyone in Amazon did, but he needed it desperately. His son was about to start middle school. His sister was sick. His mother's hospice bills were piling up. All these worries had kept the lieutenant and his wife awake for months. And now, fate had placed in his hands a unique opportunity to solve them all at once. It would only take betraying the memory of his fallen comrades. The lieutenant's stomach tightened. Although he had never claimed to be a saint, Alfonso Tavares was convinced he knew the difference between a lack of mercy and outright cruelty. Well, right up until this bloody mess, yes. A beat. They wouldn't have hesitated. Lieutenant Tavares didn't even realize he had spoken these words out loud, like a sentence, sealing his decision as he shoved Sergeant Viana's dead body into the water. The lieutenant would never know that these were his last words. He barely felt the dart lodge itself in his neck, piercing through the layers of skin with unnerving ease. Unfortunately for him, he did feel the agony of the swelling that formed in his throat, as the venom soaked into the projectile spread through his system, blocking his airways and causing his tongue to double in size within seconds. The lieutenant collapsed, gasping and suffocating. He remained conscious just long enough to see the silhouette rise out of her hiding place, a woman with long, dark hair. She had patiently waited, nestled in the hollow of a dead tree, letting the lieutenant dispose of the bodies in her place. The strange woman then leaped down from the promontory to stand over the lieutenant. With a simple gesture, she scared away the petrosaurs that had begun gathering around the lieutenant, drawn by the scent of death after what had obviously been a disappointing day of fishing in the river. They would have torn into Lieutenant Tavares before the poison had time to finish its work, so the young woman waited just long enough to make sure the officer had taken his final breath, and then only she stepped aside to let the creatures feast. She knew the difference between a lack of mercy and outright cruelty.